A quiet morning ritual was violently interrupted by a man who mistook dignity for weakness. He had no idea that one slap would trigger a reckoning that would dismantle his entire world. The scent of roasted coffee and old books. That was my Tuesday morning. For the last 15 years, since my Eleanor passed, that's how I've started my Tuesdays and Thursdays. A small table in the corner of The Daily Grind, a cup of black coffee, and the worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea that she gave me on my 65th birthday. At 85, routine isn't just a habit, it's an anchor. It's a quiet conversation with the ghosts you love. The table was our table, tucked away by the window where the morning sun would warm her side of the booth. I still sat on my side, leaving her space empty. Some of the younger staff probably thought I was just a lonely old man, but Sarah, the morning barista, she understood. She'd bring my coffee over without me even ordering it, a small, kind smile on her face. "Morning, Arthur," she'd say. The usual. That morning, however, the usual was shattered by a voice that sounded like gravel in a blender. "Excuse me, you're in my seat." I looked up from my book, blinking slowly. A man, probably in his late 50s, stood over my table. He wore a suit that was too tight and an expression that was too smug. He smelled of expensive cologne and impatience. I glanced around. The cafe was half empty. There were plenty of other tables. I gave him a polite, if weary, smile. "I'm sorry, son. I don't think I heard you right." He sighed, a dramatic, theatrical sound meant for an audience. "My seat," he repeated, tapping a manicured finger on the table, perilously close to Eleanor's empty space. "I have this table reserved every Tuesday for a business meeting." Sarah, bless her heart, rushed over from behind the counter. "Mr. Henderson, sir, I am so sorry. There must have been a mix-up. We don't usually take reservations. Arthur here is a regular." Henderson cut her off with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of pure dismissal. He didn't even look at her. His eyes, cold and gray, were locked on me. "I don't care if he's the Pope. I have a standing arrangement. Now are you going to move, old man, or do I have to get the manager? I've lived 85 years on this earth. I was born in Alabama in 1938. I've seen the back of the bus, the separate fountains, the sneers, and the threats. I've seen men like Mr. Henderson my whole life. Men who believe the world is a chair, and they're the only ones entitled to sit in it. I gently close my book, marking my page with a steady finger. "There's no need for that," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "There are several other tables available. I'm sure one of them will suit your needs." His face, which was already a blotchy pink, began to creep toward crimson. It was like watching a thermometer rise. "Do you not understand English? This is my table. I pay good money here. What do you contribute? Buying one cheap coffee and squatting for 3 hours?" The other patrons were starting to stare now. A young couple in the corner lowered their phones. The quiet hum of the cafe had died, replaced by a tense silence. I looked at the empty space beside me, at the ghost of my wife's smile in the morning sun. This was more than a table. It was a memory. It was my sanctuary. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through me before meeting his gaze again. "Sir," I said, my voice still even, "a little kindness costs nothing. It seems you've overdrawn your account." I don't think he even processed the words. He only heard the tone, the refusal, the calm defiance of an old black man who was supposed to be invisible, who was supposed to fold under pressure. His nostrils flared. His hand came up so fast I barely saw it. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack that echoed in the silent room. My head snapped to the side, and my glasses flew from my face, clattering onto the floor. A collective gasp went through the cafe. Sarah cried out, "Oh my God!" My cheek stung, a hot, radiating shame that had nothing to do with the physical pain. It was the pure, unadulterated humiliation of it. Mr. Henderson stood over me, his chest puffed out, his hand still slightly raised. He looked down at me, slumped in my seat, and a cruel little smirk played on his lips. "Maybe that'll teach an old man some respect for his betters," he sneered, turning to the horrified barista. "Now clean this mess up and get me a double espresso." My hand trembled slightly as I reached down to pick up my glasses. One of the lenses was cracked. I put them on anyway. The world looked fractured, split down the middle. But my vision had never been clearer. I didn't look at the other patrons. I didn't look at Sarah, who was frozen behind the counter with tears in her eyes. I looked directly at Mr. Henderson, who was straightening his tie as if he'd just swatted a fly. He had made a mistake. He thought he had slapped a feeble, forgotten old man. He had no idea who he had just assaulted. With a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to take all the strength I had, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my old flip phone. It was simple, just how I liked it. My son, David, had tried to get me one of those new smartphones, but I preferred the big buttons, especially the one at the top of my contact list. Mr. Henderson scoffed. "What are you going to do? Call the police. Don't waste your breath. I'll have them shining my shoes." I just smiled, a sad, thin smile. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not calling the police. I'm calling my son. He always told me, 'Dad, if you ever have any trouble, you call me first. Any trouble at all.'" I flipped the phone open and pressed the speed dial button. It began to ring, a sound that, to me, was louder than any bomb. He had no idea what kind of trouble was about to rain down on his perfectly ordered world. The phone rang once, then twice. Henderson let out a sharp, derisive laugh that made my teeth ache. "Who you callin', Pops? Your bingo partner. The retirement home to complain about the jello." He winked at the petrified young couple in the corner, as if inviting them to share the joke. They just stared back, their faces pale. My son picked up on the third ring. "Dad, is everything okay? You never call this early." David's voice, always so calm, so steady, even through the tiny, tinny speaker of my old flip phone. It was the voice that had once talked a terrified 8-year-old me down from a tall oak tree, and the same voice that, decades later, had calmly briefed the president in the Situation Room. Of course, Henderson wouldn't know that. I kept my own voice low, steadying it against the tremor of adrenaline. "I'm fine, son. Just a little disturbance." I didn't take my eyes off Henderson, who was now leaning over the table, his cheap cologne an assault on my senses. "I'm at the daily grind. A gentleman here seems to believe he's entitled to my table." Henderson must have caught the words because he leaned even closer, his voice a low growl. "A disturbance. Tell your boy I'm about to cause a real one if you don't get your ancient bones out of my chair." I continued as if he hadn't spoken. "He put his hands on me, David." I said the words plainly, without embellishment. The truth was ugly enough on its own. A beat of silence stretched across the line from Washington, D.C. to this little corner coffee shop. It was a deep, profound silence that felt like the pressure dropping before a hurricane. When David spoke again, his voice was completely different. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp, like forged steel. "Dad," he said, his tone clipped and precise. "Are you hurt?" Each word was a separate, distinct event. "Just my pride, son, and my glasses." "Stay right where you are," he commanded. "Don't move. Don't say another word to him. I'm handling it." The line went dead. I folded the phone shut and placed it gently on the table next to my copy of Hemingway. I picked up my coffee cup. My hand perfectly steady now. The tremor was gone, replaced by a profound and heavy certainty. The storm was coming. Henderson, blissfully ignorant, saw my quietude as surrender. He puffed out his chest, a victorious smirk spreading across his face. "So, what's your big-shot son gonna do? Write a strongly worded letter to the editor? I've got a dozen lawyers on retainer who would eat him for breakfast." He snapped his fingers at Sarah, who was still standing behind the counter, her own phone in her hand as she debated what to do. "Espresso, now, or is everyone in this dump deaf and stupid as well as slow?" Sarah flinched and hurried to the machine, her hands shaking. No one else moved. The cafe was a wax museum of silent, staring figures. I took a slow sip of my cooling coffee. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Henderson paced back and forth in the small space in front of my table, repeatedly checking a gold watch on his wrist that was probably worth more than my entire monthly pension. "Unbelievable," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The absolute worst service in this city. And you," he jabbed a thick finger in my direction, "are going to pay for my wasted time. Believe me." The bell over the cafe door chimed softly. It was a sound I heard a dozen times every Tuesday, but this time it cut through the tense atmosphere like a scalpel. Two men stepped inside. They were not cops. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits that fit them a little too well, hinting at the lean muscle underneath. They didn't have the weary posture of beat cops or the rumpled look of detectives. They moved with an unnerving, synchronized grace, their eyes sweeping the room in a single, practiced motion. They saw the other patrons. They saw the terrified barista. They saw the fuming Mr. Henderson. And then their eyes landed on me. Their entire demeanor shifted. It was a subtle change, but it was unmistakable. They went from assessing a situation to securing an asset. Henderson, too engrossed in his own self-importance, didn't notice them until they were halfway across the room. He turned to say something else to me, saw them approaching, and sneered. "Oh, look, your son sent the social workers." The two men walked right past him as if he were a piece of furniture. They stopped at my table. The taller of the two leaned down slightly, his voice a respectful murmur that somehow carried across the entire silent cafe. "Mr. Franklin, sir?" he asked. His gaze flickered for a nanosecond to the bright red mark blooming on my cheek and the cracked lens of my glasses, and I saw a flash of something cold and dangerous in his eyes before it was gone. "Director Franklin sent us. He wants to assure you that he is personally en route. Are you all right, sir?" The cup in Henderson's hand trembled, sloshing hot espresso over his fingers. He barely noticed. He slowly turned, his face a mask of utter confusion. "Director?" he stammered, his bravado evaporating like mist. "Director of what? Who the hell is Director Franklin?" He looked from the two stone-faced men in suits to me, the quiet old man with the broken glasses, and back again. For the first time, a sliver of genuine fear pierced through his arrogant certainty. He was beginning to understand that he hadn't just slapped an old man. He had poked something he shouldn't have. The taller agent looked past Henderson, addressing the entire room now. His voice was calm, but it held the absolute weight of authority. "The perimeter is secure. The director's instructions are clear." He finally turned his gaze on Henderson, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. "No one leaves this room." The words, "no one leaves this room," hung in the air, thick and heavy as humidity before a storm. Henderson's face went from blotchy red to a pasty, sickly white. The smugness drained away, replaced by the dawning horror of a man realizing he stepped on a landmine and just heard the click. "Perimeter? Director?" he sputtered, his voice cracking. "What is this? This is a coffee shop. You can't hold me here. I have rights." The second agent, the shorter one with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, gave Henderson a look so devoid of emotion it was chilling. "Sir," he said, his voice flat and monotonous, "I strongly suggest you return to your seat and remain silent." It wasn't a request. It was an order wrapped in the thinnest veneer of civility. Henderson, for all his bluster, seemed to recognize the tone. It was the sound of a man who could break him in half without changing his heart rate. He backed away from my table, stumbling slightly, and sank into a nearby chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. His eyes darted around the room, from the two agents standing like sentinels by the door, to the terrified barista, to the other patrons who were now trying very hard to look like they were part of the wallpaper. Finally, his panicked gaze landed back on me. On me. The harmless old man he'd slapped without a second thought. The confusion in his eyes was warring with a rapidly growing fear. I took another slow sip of my coffee. It was almost cold now, but I didn't mind. I watched him over the rim of the cup, my expression unreadable. I felt a grim satisfaction, not in his fear, but in the swift, undeniable rebalancing of the scales of justice. He thought he was a big man because he could bully an 85-year-old. He was about to learn what real power looked like, and it had nothing to do with a tight suit or a loud voice. It was quiet. It was efficient. And it was now focused entirely on him. Less than 5 minutes later, the chime over the door sounded again. This time there was no mistaking the shift in the atmosphere. The two agents straightened to full attention, their hands clasped behind their backs. The air crackled. Through the door stepped my son, David. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a simple charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark blue tie, but he carried with him an aura of command that filled the entire room. He was taller than I remembered, his shoulders broader. The lines of stress around his eyes, the ones I knew came from sleepless nights spent protecting an entire nation, seemed deeper today. His eyes, the same warm brown as his mother's, scanned the room, passed over the agents, passed over the other patrons, and found me. The hard, icy mask of the Director of Homeland Security dissolved for just a second. For a fleeting moment, he was just my son. His eyes filled with a raw, visceral concern that made my throat tighten. He saw my cracked glasses. He saw the red handprint blooming on my dark skin. And the mask slammed back down, colder and harder than before. He walked toward my table, his footsteps echoing in the tomb-like silence. He ignored Henderson completely, as if the man were nothing more than a stain on the floor. He knelt beside my chair, his knee touching the worn linoleum. He took my hand, his grip warm and strong. "Dad," he said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. "Are you okay?" I squeezed his hand back. "I'm fine, David. A little shaken, that's all." He looked at my cheek, his jaw tightening so hard I could see the muscle bunch beneath his skin. "Who did this?" he asked, though he already knew. His gaze slowly, deliberately, lifted from me and settled on the trembling man in the other chair. Henderson shrank under that gaze. He tried to speak, but only a squeak came out. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice a reedy, pathetic version of its former boom. "Now, see here. This is a misunderstanding. A simple disagreement over a table." David rose to his full height, a towering figure of quiet fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The venom in his whisper was more potent than any shout. "A disagreement?" he repeated, taking a slow step toward Henderson. "You put your hands on an 85-year-old man, my father." Henderson started to blabber, words tumbling over each other in a desperate, incoherent stream. "I didn't know." He was being stubborn. "I had a very important meeting. My clients are very powerful people." David held up a single hand, and the babbling stopped instantly. "Your clients," David said, his voice dropping another octave, becoming a quiet, menacing purr, "cannot help you now. You seem to be a man who understands power and influence, Mr. Henderson. So let me explain my position. My name is David Franklin." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. The young couple in the corner, the ones who had been on their phones, both gasped. The guy's eyes were wide. It was a name most people only ever heard on the news, usually in the context of national emergencies or terrorist threats. "And you," David continued, his voice lethally calm, "just assaulted the man who taught me everything I know about right and wrong. You picked a fight in a coffee shop, and in doing so, you have just declared war on the entire United States Department of Homeland Security." He leaned in close, his face inches from Henderson's. "And Mr. Henderson, we don't lose." That final sentence seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Henderson's face, which had cycled through every shade of red and white, now settled on a ghastly, mottled gray. His jaw worked, but no sounds came out. The name, David Franklin, had finally landed, followed by the crushing weight of his title. This wasn't just some angry son. This was a man who commanded legions, a man whose signature could freeze bank accounts, ground airplanes, and make people disappear into the labyrinthine world of federal acronyms. The bully, the man who built his world on the intimidation of those he deemed lesser, was now facing an entity so far beyond his comprehension that his brain simply short-circuited. David straightened up, turning his back on the now catatonic Henderson, as if he was no longer worth his attention. He walked back to my table and gently took my arm. "Let's go, Dad. I'll have someone get you a new pair of glasses." He helped me to my feet, his touch firm and reassuring. As we walked towards the door, he nodded to the taller of the two agents. "Agent Cross, take Mr. Henderson's statement, and then I want a full-spectrum analysis. Financials, business partners, digital footprint, travel history, everything. I want to know if he so much as jaywalked in the last 20 years. Inform the IRS there may be cause for a full audit of his and his company's finances, and have TSA flag his passport. Effective immediately." Each directive was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Henderson's life. He wasn't being arrested, not in the traditional sense. He was being dismantled. His life was about to be put under a microscope so powerful that every tiny flaw, every shady deal, every undeclared dollar would be magnified into a federal crime. That was David's power, not brute force, but the overwhelming, crushing weight of the system he commanded. As we reached the door, Henderson finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, whimpering sound. "Please, I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll apologize. It was a mistake." David paused at the door, but he didn't turn around. He just spoke over his shoulder, his voice cold and final. "Kindness is free, Mr. Henderson. You chose to be cruel. Now you can pay the price. My father is a veteran of the Korean War. He marched for his civil rights in Selma. He has contributed more to this country with his quiet dignity than you ever will with your loud money. You didn't just slap an old man. You dishonored a patriot. The misunderstanding is over. The consequences are just beginning." And with that, we stepped out of the coffee shop into the bright morning sun, leaving Henderson to the two agents and the complete and utter ruin of his life. Outside, a black SUV was waiting at the curb, the kind with tinted windows that you see in movies. Another agent opened the door for us. As I settled into the plush leather seat, David sat beside me. The intensity of the director fell away, and he was just my son again. He looked at me, his eyes filled with that familiar worry. "Are you sure you're okay, Dad?" I reached out and patted his hand. "I'm fine, son. You didn't have to do all that." He shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. "Yes, I did. There are some lines that don't get crossed. Family is one of them. Respect is another." He picked up a small, insulated bag from the seat between us. "I had them stop and get you something." He opened it, and the rich, familiar scent of roasted coffee filled the car. It was a cup from the daily grind. He'd even had them make a fresh one for Eleanor's side. As the SUV pulled smoothly into traffic, I looked back at the little cafe. I could see Henderson through the window, his head in his hands with Agent Cross standing over him, notebook out. I saw Sarah the barista talking to the other agent, a look of profound relief on her face. The world was righting itself. I took a sip of the fresh, hot coffee. It tasted like victory. I knew I'd be back at my table on Thursday morning. The sun would warm Eleanor's empty seat, I would read my book, and I would remember the day a petty bully learned a very important lesson. You never know whose son is watching. And some sons, well, some sons command the storm.